Sarvebhyo Namaha. A very warm welcome to this lecture series which seeks to introduce Kannada writers and their work to non-Kannadigas. Today is the concluding part of this webinar, and I extend a very warm welcome to the President of Kuvempu Bhasha Bharati Pradhikara, the Registrar, the members of the Executive Committee, and all our listeners. Today we have amidst us Sri Sandeep Balakrishna to talk to us about Sri D.V. Gundappa or DVG. And most Kannada people would have listened to Sri D.V. Gundappa's name. And let me take a free few moments to introduce this lecture series to contextualize very briefly. Why is this important? Why has such a lecture series become important? I think it is because the people who have been spoken about in this lecture series, starting from Manjeshwara Govindapai to Kuvempu, Masti Venkatesh Iyengar, Dara Bendre, and today D.V. Gundappa, these writers primarily worked during what is known as the Navodaya movement in Kannada literature. And the Navodaya movement in Kannada literature, as all of us know, was marked by two characteristics. One, it was very much alive to our own native ethos. It was rooted in our native ethos. And two, it is because um, it was also open to ideas from the West. So the writers, they amalgamated these two aspects very well in their works, and that is very important. The non-Kannada writers will benefit, and even the readers will benefit a lot from accessing the writings of these Kannada writers who wrote during the Navodaya movement. And one more feature of their works is they were all polymaths and polyglots. So their writings were invariably tinged with a perspective drawn from a variety of subjects. So by going through their works, not only do we get access to a plethora of subjects, but also on various literary genres. We can read novels, we can learn about discursive essays, full-fledged epic poems, and so many things like that. And DVG, I think, is one of the best representatives of the Navodaya movement. And although he wrote in English, which is the linked language that we are presently using to communicate to our non Kannada audience, he primarily wrote in English on subjects such as politics, contemporary issues, economic policies, and things like that. Whereas in Kannada, he focused mainly on literature, culture, and philosophy. And that, I think, is the distinguishing feature, wherein he embraces in one sweep all these subjects. And one feature of it is that he brings a gentle reassurance. The tone of gentle reassurance that he gives to us in his writings is most important for us today. I think in the times we live of uncertainties, getting access to this feature of DVG's writings is significant to us. And we hope that through this talk, our non-Kannadiga people, the audiences, will also gain access to these features of DVG's writings. And to talk to us about DVG, we have Sri Sandeep Balakrishna. He is an author, he is an editor, speaker, columnist, and an independent researcher. And for the past 20 years, he has been active in the areas of Indian history, culture, literature, and contemporary issues. And he has worked on various books such as Tipu Sultan, the Tyrant of Mysore, the Madurai Sultanate, 70 Years of Secularism, and he has been celebrated as the translator of landmark novels authored by Sri S.L. Bhairappa, such as Avarana as The Veil in English, and also Orphaned, which is the translation of Tabbaliyoni Nadamagane. And most importantly for us today, I think, he has been working on a biography of DVG, focusing on his contributions to public life and politics. And this is in English. So I think we can find no one better than Sri Sandeep Balakrishna to speak to us on DVG. So without further ado, I express and extend a very warm welcome to Sandeep. And this webinar, this lecture series, will continue in the next week as well. So all of you are invited to participate in all these proceedings. Thank you very much.
ॐ Namaste, and a very warm welcome to all of you. At the outset, I would like to express my heartfelt thanks and gratitude to Kuvempu Bhasha Bharati for organizing this wonderful lecture series, and to Dr. Ajakala Girish Bhatt and his entire team, and also for my good friend Shri Shashi Kiran for introducing me so generously. But more importantly, my thanks go out to Shashi for uh, briefly in very brief words for setting the context in a comprehensive fashion. So thank you, Shashi Kiran, for that. And I also take great pleasure in welcoming all of you in the audience. I consider it my privilege to speak in this lecture series titled Kannada Literature for Non-Kannadigas, which is actually a much needed and also a timely initiative organized by the Bhasha Bharati. But above all, I regard it as my honor and my sacred duty to speak about a few literary works and an overall introduction to the body of literary corpus of a poet, a literature, a cultural icon, and an Acharya Purusha, and a true rishi of modern Indian Renaissance, Shri D.V. Gundappa, or fondly known by all Kannadigas as DVG, just three affectionate letters. Now, for the purpose of this lecture, I have kind of divided into 4 or 5 brief parts. With the first part includes a brief introduction to DVG's personality, basically, and his legacy. The second is about an overall few words about the overall literary corpus of DVG. Then in the third part, I'll touch upon a few points on the various genres of literature that DVG worked in. And in the fourth part, I'll say a few. I've selected a couple of his plays just to give a flair and an introduction to the main of DVG's literature. And finally, I will dive into these two of his selected works. Now, to begin with, trying to capture the full legacy of DVG is like trying to imprisoning an ocean in a teacup. So, even just to give the briefest idea of his contributions, his multifaceted contributions, really, DVG identified himself primarily as a journalist and editor, and he remained one till his last breath. And his service to journalism was a brilliant and even a pious service, a sacred service record of nearly 65 years. DVG was a poet, a playwright, a freedom fighter, a statesman, an MLC, a biographer, a publicist, an aesthete, a polyglot, a philosopher, and last but not the least, a public eminence in the real sense of the word. In fact, few Kannadiga luminaries have enjoyed the kind of statewide popularity that DVG enjoyed in his own time. And just to give an anecdote, it is said that the proverbial common man would write letters to DVG, and in the address box, they would simply write as DV Gundappa, Bangalore. And the letters would unfailingly reach DVG. No address, no full postal address, just DVG Bangalore. So this should give us a taste of his kind of eminence and prestige and popularity in his own time. And this apart, DVG was also recognized as an important voice of public conscience in various circles, like in political circles, social, literary, cultural, and even what is known as the elite circles of his time. And these circles, this recognition remained intact, and in fact, it grew. This prestige, his eminence, grew only with the passing times. It is a great record spanning over more than half a century. His range of acquaintances and associates and friends and others included various Maharajas of different princely states, at least 5 Divans of the Mysore Samsthanam, Sir M. Vishveshwaraya, Shri S. Subramanya Iyer, Shri V.S. Srinivasa Shastri, Mysore Vasudevacharya, the celebrated musician, P.V. Kane, Professor M. Hiriyanna, Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya, and others. And as editor and journalist, DVG founded and edited several bi-weeklies and journals, and wrote for at least 35 publications. His journalistic corpus in both English and Kannada runs into about 15,000 pages, if not more. DVG wrote on a range of subjects, including politics, current affairs, culture, music, art, books, public policy, health, education, law, biographies, and profiles of eminent people, reminiscences, uh, treatises on princely states, temple reforms, different aspects of the Hindu society, historical topics, language, grammar. I think I'll stop here. So, one defining quality of all these writings on such diverse topics is the uniformity of their standard, of their rigor, clarity, eloquence, and stylistic elegance. No matter what the subject was, there is no dip in these standards. And from this perspective, it becomes a Herculean task, if someone is asked to, select materials from DVG to compile a volume, titled The Best of DVG, it really becomes a Herculean task given, all these, this level of standard. So, however, I am extremely happy and delighted to report that a series of such anthologies or selections from DVG's writing has already come out with a title. The series title is Selected English Writings of D.V. Gundappa, which is published by the Gokhale Institute of Public Affairs, and Sri Shashi Kiran is one of the compilers. So far, 7 beautiful bound volumes have been published over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, and I highly recommend that all of you buy these volumes and read them. Now, this is a brief summary of DVG's corpus of non-fiction, his body of non-fiction work. If this is on one side, an entirely new and enchanting world opens up in front of us when we survey the body of his creative literature, what is generally known as fiction. And without doubt, the finest selections of his literary works can easily occupy the top slot in the annals of the great works in world literature. Exquisite classicality is one of the central or the fundamental or the defining characteristic of DVG's creative literature. And the best of these are underscored and inspired and motivated in turn, by the best of Sanskrit literature, which includes but is not limited to the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, Kalidasa, and our various classical Sanskrit poets and Kannada, Telugu, Tamil poets, our Puranic and Upanishadic lore. But on a broad canvas, DVG's literary corpus can be thematically divided as Indian and non-Indian, classical and contemporary. But I must say that these are not categories which can be set in stone. I've broadly classified them for convenience and easy understanding. But the singular work that catapulted DVG into permanent and enduring literary fame is his magnum opus, Mankutimmana Kagga. It is in Kannada. It is a boutique of 743 contemplative verses on a wide range of topics, including life, philosophy, the meaning of life, rather deep topics, written in very simple simple language set to meter, but the profundity is just extraordinary. Mankutimmana Kagga, or simply Kagga, is widely regarded as the Bhagavad Gita in Kannada. Among other things, Mankutimmana Kagga's roaring success and enduring success, in a way, actually dimmed the brilliance of the other works of DVG, other literary creations of DVG, both belonging to the pre-Kagga period and the post-Kagga period. To quote the memorable words of Dr. S.R. Ramaswamy, Mankutimmana Kagga has single-handedly spawned a cottage industry over half a century. Kaggada ಉಪಜೀವಿಕೆಗಳು ಎಷ್ಟೊಂದಿದೆ ಅಂತ. Meaning in Kannada, a lot of people have earned their livelihood based on writing commentaries on Mankutimmana Kagga. And every year, a new Mankutimmana Kagga commentary is published. Now, in the realm of form, DVG largely, wrote poetry. Majority of his creative literature is in the poetic form, and he authored a total of 9 plays. DVG did not attempt short stories and novels, which I think is largely consistent with the spirit of dense classicism that was throbbing in his veins. Verse and versification came naturally to him, which was akin to breathing. Here was a great litterateur and a savant who had completely surrendered to our ancient rishis, who in turn were also kavis. So the word rishi and kavi can be, called as synonyms. So DVG had surrendered to our ancient rishis, and he had also submitted himself to Valmiki, Vyasa, Vedavyasa, Kalidasa, Kumaravyasa, and Tyagaraja, among others. And from their eternal imprint, left by their sacred feet, DVG collected gems and pearls and rubies and other precious metals and made them his own, and then distributed free of cost. So even DVG's plays or dramas properly belong to what is known as dramatic poesy, to borrow from John Dryden. And like in our classical poetry tradition, all of DVG's verses can be set to tune and sung. So, for example, DVG has himself suggested the ragas and talas for poems or poetry collections or narrative poems such as Antavpura Geetegalu, Geeta Shakuntala, and so on. With this backdrop, we can now briefly consider some of DVG's literary themes. In the annals of Indian classical literature, these include poetry such as Antavpura Geete, which I just quoted, which is a long narrative song expounding the philosophy and aesthetic and other aspects of the Beluru Channakeshava temple. Then we have Geeta Shakuntala, which is basically selections from Kavikulaguru Kalidasa's immortal play Abhignana Shakuntala. Then we have Sri Rama Parikshanam and Sri Krishna Parikshanam, 2 separate works, which are both unique and creative poetic expressions analyzing various facets of Sri Ramachandra and Sri Krishna. Then we also have other poetry collections such as Vasanta Kusumanjali, Nivedana, and so on. This apart, DVG also wrote a companion of sorts to Mankutimmana Kagga, which is titled Marula Muniyana Kagga. Now, in the non-Indian annals, that is themes borrowed from literary annals outside India, DVG wrote various adaptations and translations, and chief among these are Umarana Usage, which is a Kannada adaptation of Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat. It still retains its popularity in Kannada literature. DVG's translation of Shakespeare's celebrated tragedy Macbeth, it was pioneering in every sense, and it became a model for later Kannada translators of Shakespeare and other great literatures from the Western canon. Then he also translated Kanaka Luka, which is a Kannada name of Alfred Tennyson's The Cup. And now, after this, one noteworthy feature in all these Kannada translations of non-Indian works done by DVG is how he never wavers from the classicism. from his classicism. So only the theme is non-Indian, the idiom, the versification, the other wordplay and stylistic elements, all of them thoroughly adhere to the Indian classical traditions. And these translations are also, like I said, seminal or pioneering models of cultural adaptation itself, using literature as both the vehicle and the medium. So, from one perspective, this may be called the perfect Kannadaization of Shakespeare. Relatively speaking, DVG's plays did not enjoy the same level of success and acclaim as his poetry enjoyed. His 9 plays are spread over about 400 or 500 pages, if not more. And while they are delightful and reflect fine taste, they cannot be adapted to the stage. And of these 9 plays, 4 are translations, respectively Gita Shakuntala, Kanakaluka, Macbeth, and Jack Cade. The other 5 are his own, which is respectively Tilottame, Shri Vidyaranya Vijayam, Parashurama, Mahachunavane, and Gardhaba Vijaya. Now, although all his plays are imbued with great value, they have enormous literary merit and they provide aesthetic joy and delight. In the final analysis, we have to agree with Hama Nayak or H.M. Nayak's grounded assessment, and I quote, DVG's plays have failed to establish his reputation as a formidable playwright. The drama became one of the mediums for him to elucidate his philosophy and ideals of life. However, DVG's plays must be necessarily evaluated from perspectives other than that of drama or the stage. Close quote. Now, in this background, we can now consider 3 works, which I hope will give a flair of DVG's sweep, his literary tenor, the quality of his literary prowess as well. These 3 works are a part of a collection named Prahasanatrayi. And I have 3 or 4 major reasons for selecting this particular anthology or collection. And the first major reason for selecting these 3 works is the fact that today they are so obscure that they've almost been forgotten even by the avowed fans and admirers and devotees of Sri D.V. Gundappa. The second reason is their theme, which is largely politics and public life. And the third and the final reason is to offer a brief appreciation of DVG's skill and prowess at creating effective parodies and satire. So this is one of the lesser known facets of DVG's literary contribution or his literary strength. Now, as the title itself suggests, Prahasana in general is the literary genre or form of a satire or a farce. And so, Prahasana Trayi literally means 3 farces or a collection of 3 farces. This collection includes 2 plays and 1 lavani. So we'll quickly examine what these things and then we can get into details. So the first is a play called Jack Cade, which is actually a Kannada adaptation, translated adaptation. It contains extracts from Shakespeare's play named Henry VI, Part 2. The second, like I said, is a Lavani, which is titled Mahachunavane, or its literal meaning is general elections. The third is another play titled Gardhaba Vijaya, or the Triumph of Donkeys. All 3 works are unified by the twin threads of satire, and it is a satire on the pathetic state of Indian democracy that had just taken shape after 1947 or 1950 or 51. More importantly, all 3 works in this collection were the outpouring of DVG's pain and outrage at how public life had been debased and disfigured so early. It was also his literary protest against how the political leaders after independence were insulting and humiliating the sacrifices of countless, of the freedom struggle made by countless men like DVG. So, Gardhaba Vijaya, or the triumph of, now I'll give you a couple of points on the timeline. Gardhaba Vijaya is the last in this collection, and the Triumph of Donkeys, basically. It was written on 1st January 1975, which was just 9 months before DVG merged his mortal body into eternity. Jack Cade was written in 1959, and Mahachunavane was written in 1965. DVG's introduction or preface to Prahasanatrayi is quite remarkable. Uh, it is quite pithy, it's very, very brief actually, and its brevity itself hides its profundity. His opening read line in that preface reads as follows, and I'll translate this. ವೇದಗಳು ಬ್ರಹ್ಮನನ್ನು ಕುರಿತದ್ದು, ಈ ಪ್ರಹಸನಗಳು ತಿಮ್ಮನನ್ನು ಕುರಿತವು. ಹೀಗೆ ಬ್ರಹ್ಮ ವಿಚಾರವನ್ನು ತಿಮ್ಮನಿಗೆ ಅನ್ವಯಿಸುವುದೇ ಹೇಳನ ಹಾಸ್ಯ. So, to summarize this in a English translation, satire or parody or sarcastic comedy is that which reduces the lofty and the sublime to the vulgar and the ridiculous. So, with that, we'll for this lecture, I mean, given the space duration for this lecture, I have considered only two selections, which is Jack Cade and Mahachunavane. So, we'll get into we'll now examine some major aspects of Jack Cade. So, this is DVG's translation of the Jack Cade episode, which occurs in Shakespeare's play Henry VI, Part 2, Act 4. So, in the introduction to this play, to the translation, DVG recounts the inspiration and the impetus to write it. So, the story was that barely some days or a few weeks after India got freedom in 1947, DVG and a few of his colleagues or friends were invited to deliver a lecture in a village some 20 miles from Bengaluru. The audience, and then they went there, he had to give a lecture on the importance of freedom, nationalism, the struggles and all that. Lofty lecture. So, including DVG, all the his colleagues also delivered the lecture, and then DVG, as a speaker, even as he spoke, he saw that the audience found the lecture completely boring. And then once these people had finished, DVG had finished speaking, the next speaker, he ascended the dais and he spoke the language, the coarse language of coarse agitation, provocation, and violence, and thundered about extracting violent justice because the power is with us now. So DVG describes it quite picturesquely, that slapping his thighs and sharpening his mustache and all that. The crowd, which found DVG's speech boring, rose up with a thundering applause. And when DVG noticed that, that incident impacted DVG for several days, and he became pensive and introspective, and finally he writes about this. Here he is referring to that incident and speakers of that kind. He says, here he is, Jack Cade, our own Jack Cade, and Cade's story is a story of the present time in our country. The impetus to write this play, to translate this play, then became urgent, also owing to the insistence of some of my young friends. Close quote. Now, before we get into the play itself, a brief historical background is necessary. Jack Cade was not a king, but even today, his name has become immortal, kind of immortal, as one of the most celebrated rebels and anarchists of 15th century England in the regime of Henry VI. He was a real historical person. Jack Cade's rebellion was against the corrupt barons and aristocrats and bureaucrats surrounding Henry VI, was the king of England then. Cade and his army of rebels managed, he collected army of more than 5,000 rebels, and his initial rebellion was extremely successful. There were a bunch of rowdy mobs who stopped at nothing, and they became completely unhinged. Basically, they were waiting for an outlet for their pent up violence, and so it became extremely violent and extremely successful in the short run. So, to the extent that all these his loose army of rebels, they managed to seize and vandalize the London Bridge itself. So, this finally instilled a sort of fear within the King Henry himself. And although the rebellion ultimately failed, and Jack Cade, he died a broken man eventually. He met a brutal end, but that's a different story. He remains, like I said, he remains one of the world's early anarchists in the medieval time. He remains an anarchist who perhaps met the fate he deserved, and notwithstanding Henry VI's corrupt officials. Both Jack Cade's rebellion and Henry's era is a classic real life lesson of history that the human condition is largely colored with a million tinges of gray and is not strictly black and white. Now, when we juxtapose DVG's temperament and ideals and worldview with this play, it is but natural that Jack Cade's story resonated him at a very, very deep level. For one thing, DVG had a distaste for, actually he actually hated and feared anarchy. With great passion, he did not like anarchy and violent agitations and disturbances. He was the, both in his private and public life and his positions, he was the man of the proverbial golden meal. Above all, in public life, DVG, actually in all spheres, DVG prized stability, and this nature of DVG was the philosophical and pragmatic lesson that our Sanatana or Hindu or Indian tradition had taught him. So, disturbance of order was a condition which was tantamount to national suicide and cultural annihilation in DVG's view. And so, when DVG watched the slow emergence of this kind of violent agitational politics, his worst fears began to slowly come true. That this slow emergence of anarchy, agitational and politics of violent street level protest, uh, just merely a decade after independence, he began to spot Jack Cade's, and all round violent demagogues and avowed destroyers of culture and tradition and all their fellow groups and their followers. So he was deeply afraid. The historical Jack Cade, after achieving his initial victories, like I said, he imprisons or he holds hostage of a nobleman named Say. He's a lord and kind of a baron. And then he's bound and fettered. And this guy, Jack Cade, he gives a speech and basically he scolds this guy, this nobleman. And I quote what he says: "You rich people, all you lords and barons, you know how to read and write. You think you're scholars. You have established grammar schools, and thereby you have misled our children. You have violated dignity by setting up paper factories. Our people were happy because they were illiterate, they could not read and write. And from now onwards, we will burn all your paper factories, we will set fire to all your books and destroy all your laws. Henceforth, my tongue is the British Parliament." Close quote. So, this was the exact future that DVG foresaw when he observed the kind of people who were becoming, elected as, elected to public life as MLAs or MPs or ministers. And sadly, the future, this dark future that DVG foresaw so early, it came true in 1975 with the emergency. And in fact, DVG himself provides the clues and the key to Jack Cade's in such an India, which was headed basically towards anarchy. If the emergency was not anarchy, I don't know what it is. Or at least the run up to the emergency was, unbridled anarchy over across large parts of India. Anyway, so to quote DVG's words, and this is quite profound: is it good for a people of a nation which has lived under the protection of a very ancient cultured tradition to abandon the protection of that tradition and chart its future under a system of self governance in which it has no training, much less experience? Close quote. Now, in the, from a literary perspective, Henry the Sixth Part Two is one of the minor plays of William Shakespeare, and it has been performed only a handful of times on the stage in these 500 years. But that apart, and given this fact, the fact that DVG was able to spot and select only the episode of Jack Cade, it shows DVG's insight, his felicity, his prowess, notwithstanding William Shakespeare's eminence. And by the way, if we mix languages, both Kannada and English, there is a pun in the word Cade. In Kannada, Cade or Kedu means to inflict harm, to cause injury, unprovoked injury. And in the historical context, there seems to be a dhwani or suggestion that our political class after 1947 began to do kedu or to inflict harm on the very people who had elected them. And, just to give you the, creative side of DVG, he concludes the Jack Cade play with basically an appeal to India, to Bharata Mata or something. You can loosely call it, broadly call it motherland. So he says, okay, uh, where is Cade today? He is there in every region, in every city, in every town, in every village. And the Jack Cade from Shakespeare's country, Jack Cade has spread all over the world, including India, in our own country. And Jack Cade will exist wherever there is, group-based or lobby-based politics, where there is politics of hatred and divisiveness, where there is, a loosening of simplicity and simple life in that animates the public life itself. In all these places, Cade will flourish with impunity. And it's quite a profound verse. And I will quote one thing. And typically DVG also suggests, gives hints on how to remedy such kind of situations. And he says we need to, this country does not need Jack Cade, but the kind of people who will make Jack Cade irrelevant. And this is how he says: ಅಟ್ಟದಿಂದಟ್ಟಕ್ಕೆ ಮೂಲ ಮೇಲ್ ನಡೆವ ದಿಟ್ಟ ತಾಳ್ಮೆಯುಪಾಯ ಕುಶಲ ಸಾಸವದು. Meaning, he says, self-governance or politics or democracy is an exercise of walking on a strand from office to office, or from floor to floor. And the only thing that strength that is required is patience, simplicity, and insight, more than intelligence, insight. So this is phenomenal thing, right? So with that, I think we can close the examination of Jack Cade and move on to the next quite extraordinary work in Prahasanatrayi, which is like I said, the Lavani. It is titled Mahachunavane, which in English can be translated as general elections. Now, as all of you might be familiar, Lavani is a sub category or subclass of poetry. It is a folk ballad or folk song set to simple meters. DVG's Mahachunavane or general elections is a rather unique and I can't call it original, but definitely unique work in the entire lore of DVG's creative literature. It is a short ballad running into about 12 pages, and its opening line, frankly declares its subject matter. The subject matter is an all-round description of the very first general elections held in India in 1951-52. So DVG makes no bones about his intent or the subject matter. So it is divided. It gives you an overall picture of both the atmosphere of the election, the process of election, the process of voting, post voting, what was atmosphere after voting, and then what is the final message. So what follows after this opening line is a delightful parody and brutal satire of this first great national event called elections, general elections. And the fact that DVG wrote this Prahasana or this Lavani in 1965. It's quite interesting. That year is quite interesting. So like I said, he wrote Jack Cade in 1959. So 6 years later, he wrote Mahachunavane. And from a realistic perspective, from an on the ground perspective, Mahachunavane appeared 15 years after the first general elections. That is from 1951 or 52 to 65. And the significance is as follows. By 1965, DVG had already been convinced to the point of no return. He had been convinced of the dangerous and fatal, lethal direction that Indian democracy was headed towards. But to fully appreciate the nuances of Mahachunavane, of this Lavani or ballad, uh, I sincerely, humbly recommend and suggest the audience and all of us here to read some of the issues of the Public Affairs Journal, which DVG founded and edited till his death. Uh, it was published from the Gokhale Institute of Public Affairs. I think the archives must be still available. Uh, if you read these issues, his analysis, his electoral, other analysis of current affairs and political affairs uh, that DVG has written in Public Affairs Journal, and then read Mahachunavane in light of that as a companion volume to understand it, the rewards will be actually immeasurable. So, coming back to Mahachunavane, like I said, it is a ballad rich with dhvani or suggestion, and almost every verse in this extraordinary bouquet of 60 verses, every verse drips with different dhvanis or suggestions, and it comprises 5 sections which are equally rich with suggestions, as suggestively titled, as we shall see. The first section, it is called Varanaprastha, and it sets the tone rather sardonically and leaves nothing to your imagination. It is as the satire is as direct as it can get. Now, Varanaprastha. In Varanaprastha, Varana means choice or vote. Prastha has different meanings, and some of which mean Prastha means celebration, uh, festival, a happy occasion, a party, or last but not the least, the wedding night between the bride and the bridegroom. I won't get into further things, but the suggestion encompasses all these meanings. Mahachunavane is narrated by an unnamed narrator, and he is the person who describes the 1951-52 elections to a child. And each verse ends with a refrain, Maguve, Okay, so I'll recite a couple of these verses just to give you a flair of these brilliant things. So, the first verse I've selected describes um the overall climate in which the general first national general elections were heard. Uh, the narrator describes, the kind of people. He calls it a jatre or a yatra, that kind of details, setting the ground generally speaking. So he says, ಶಿಕ್ಷಣವಂತರು ಲಕ್ಷಣವತಿಯರು ಲಕ್ಷ ಮಂದಿ ಪರಿಷೆ ಮಗುವೆ ಲಕ್ಷಾಂತರ ಪರಿಷೆ ಅಕ್ಷರವರಿಯದ ಕುಕ್ಷಿಯ ಮರೆಯದ ಅಕ್ಷ ಅಕ್ಷಯ ಜನಪರಿಷೆ ಮಗುವೆ ಸಾಕ್ಷಾತ್ ಜನಪರಿಷೆ. So what this basically means is that the kind of DVG is listing out the kind of people who came out to vote in the first general elections. Shikshanavantaru meaning educated people, Lakshanavatiyaru beautiful, lovely looking women, Lakshamandi Parishi, they came to vote in lakhs of such people came, and it was a Parishe meaning, like I said, a fair or a jatra. Akshara Variyada, apart from educated people and good looking women, Akshara Variyada Kukshiya Marayada, meaning the illiterate people or people who had no idea of the alphabet, but at the same time did not forget the pangs of their stomach, that is, the pangs of their hunger. Akshaya Jana Parishe, meaning countless were such people, such illiterate people, hungry people who came to attend and vote in these polls. And then, what was the kind of, DVG says, what was the kind of thing that went on? What was the tone, the tenor, the objective, the purpose of the election? So, this is what he says. What happened on the ground? ವರಗಳ ಮಾರಾಟವೋ ಪರಿಷೆಯಲಿ ಭರವಸೆ ವರವಿತ್ತು ಮಗುವೆ ಭರವಸೆ ವರವಿತ್ತು ಗುರುತಿನ ಚೀಟಿಯ ವರವನ್ನು ಕೊಂಡರು ಸುರರ ವರವನಲ್ಲ ಮಗುವೆ ಪರದ ವರವನಲ್ಲ. It's quite profound at many levels. So it says, ವರಗಳ ಮಾರಾಟವೋ ಪರಿಷೆಯಲಿ. In this great fair or jatra, what actually happened in the name of election or democracy or governance was the sale of promises, not promises, boons. Now there's a huge difference. Literally, what you say, zameen asman ka farak. There's a huge difference between a mere promise and a boon. A boon is given by celestial beings, but a promise is given by mortals. I don't need to elaborate on that. So it was not kind of, any kind of boons. It was a specific boon. Bharavase vara. It was only one vara. It was only one boon. What was that? The boon of promise. The promise itself was a boon. So how did it pan out? Gurutina Chitiya Varavanu Kondaru. So the voters took the, in those days of manual, not when EVMs were not there. So these were, they took various, what you call, election symbols, the printed election symbols. The voters, they basically bought it, and rather it was sold by the politicians. And this was the boon or the vara they took, and they did not take the divine boon. He says, Surara Varavanalla, Parada Varavanalla. Para means, the other realm, the divine realm, Moksha, Mukti, whatever you want to call it, different shades of meaning. So this is how, it starts, Mahachunavane. And then in the next section, which is titled Jananayaka, whose meaning must be obvious to all of you, which means a leader or a politician. Here, it describes the character and nature and qualifications of a typical politician. And DVG, is quite brutal and thoroughly merciless. It's a delight to read all these. So he says here that this political leader or politician is someone who promises the sweetness of jaggery to the voter's ear. not to his tongue. He promises the sweetness of jaggery to the voter's ear, and then DVG, he's alarmed when he notices this, and he makes a prayer to such political leaders. And I'll read out, a translation. Please, if you stop lying, that itself is national service. Close quote. So quite brutal and quite merciless. And after this, DVG begins to trace. He opens a second section with this line: "Yellinda bandayo jananayaka." Okay, he asks, "From where did you come, O Jananayaka, or O politician or public leader?" And then DVG himself, he asks the question and tries to trace the origin of this specimen of political leader. So DVG goes on a journey of this investigation of the origins of these breed of politician. His journey takes him to various forces of nature. First, the sky, and then the Patala or the netherworld, then the ocean, and then finally the world of snakes or Nagaloka. So, with each investigation, as DVG travels to each of these worlds, he juxtaposes the merits of these worlds, of each of these worlds, and then concludes that, on his return journey of each, coming back from each of these worlds, he concludes that this politician has none of the merits found in any of these worlds. And this technique of deduction is familiar to most of us as the netikrama or negation to arrive at the truth. And the truth that DVG arrives at is as follows: this average politician is a gali titti, or a windbag, or you can call it as a balloon, hot air balloon. And then we can get to the next section, which is titled Jana Janavarige, meaning among the people. Here he lists out the various political formation of DVG's time, and names political parties and different factions and ideologies of that period. And with his typical courage, I mean, he names them and shames all their cynical vote catching slogans and different underhand tactics. So we have a list here, and I'll read out all the parties and formations that his list is mentioned. Congress Party, various farmer leaders, trade unionists, socialists, what are today called as Dalit champions, the welfarists, Sarvodaya leaders, the Hindu Mahasabha, the communists, Western educated elites, and the champions of Ramarajya. And at the end, DVG is once again, I mean, his verdict is merciless. He delivers, and he doesn't deliver the verdict, it is unstated, and this is a verdict: that all these groups or political parties or formations, all of them are essentially self-servers. They have no national vision, no cultural agenda. And in the fourth section, which is titled Angaya Vaikunta, which means the Vaikunta or the abode of Lord Vishnu. So it is fittingly titled, we'll see. Angai is palm, the Vaikunta on your palm. In this section, he dwells on the aftermath of the 1951-52 elections through imaginary conversations between two or three voters. And so, although they have voted their favorite party, they know in the heart of their hearts, they are fully aware that nothing will improve, nothing will change for the better. And so, this is their conclusion. It's two or three verses here. Two or three verses actually of this conversation. And this is the conclusion of all these voters. 1. Milk supply is a reality only on government paper. 2. Grains and pulses and other food items are securely stored in the black market. And finally, 3. And even the grain and food material that is eaten as food breaks the teeth. He calls it Dantabagna, which is self-explanatory, I think. And after this, this all these whole sections are extraordinary. I don't have time. More than 60 verses out here. So I've selected a couple of representative, but uh, verses. So first, this is a very stark and extremely disturbing verse, which hits us with great impact. So he says, "Ragi bisuva kaiya rajadikara, yoga shalaya hottegai tahara," meaning, in the name of self-governance, that people are rule, citizens are the kings or rulers. In the name of that, rule by people, of the people, for the people, the guy who was the person who was used to powdering ragi for as his profession, or for centuries of years, this is the only thing that he knew. When such a person occupies, is given political power and political authority, what happens is that such authority will become the fodder for the lucky person who gets elected. And then, ಕಿವಿ ಕವಳಕ್ಕೆ ಎದೆ ಸೋತು ದವಸ ಕೈಬಿಟ್ಟವನು ತಿದಿಯ ತಬ್ಬಿದನು, which basically means, this is quite nice, very meaningful. So what he says is that unfortunate voter who gets mesmerized by the rhetoric of a politician. So kivi kavala simply means that food for the ear. So you see how many suggestions are here. So a person who gets mesmerized by, he thinks the fodder for the ear is real, and on that basis he gets swayed by it, and on that basis he surrenders his employment, or his livelihood, or his food, or whatever. In the end, he will be reduced to hugging his own skin. And then another, ಒಂದು ಪಕ್ಕದಿ ಬೆಂದ ದೋಸೆ ತಿಂದವನು ನೊಂದಾಗ ಕಂಡನ ಪಕ್ವದ ಅಂದವನು. Beautiful diction here. So it basically says, its meaning is as follows: a person who eats a dosa which has been nicely roasted only on one side, but the batter, on the other side, the batter is the same. A person who eats such a dosa, half baked or half fried dosa, in the time of his disappointment or his distress, he will realize the real meaning of this kind of half-baked dosa. And I think a more brutal, or a more honest, or a more realistic assessment of our elections, right from the first elections, general elections, plus the nature and character of our democracy ever since, is quite hard to find. And it's befitting that DVG actually chose satire as a medium to do this. And towards the end of Mahachunavane, DVG befittingly invokes Devi Bharati, or Bharata Mata, in rather pained and painful words. He says, Devi Bharati Basira ಕಿವುಚಿಕೊಳ್ಳುತ್ತಿದ್ದಳ್, ದೇವತೆಗಳು ಅದನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ನೋಡಿ ನಗುತ್ತಿರ್ದರ್. Meaning, Devi Bharati, or Bharata Mata, she is pinching her own womb with anguish and pain and hurt, whereas the celestial beings who are looking at the way our elections and democracy has evolved are laughing sarcastically. Mahachunavane concludes with a prayer, an anguished prayer, and hurt prayer to Saraswati Devi. And this is actually an extremely poignant suggestion, which I can't go into here in this duration of this lecture. Now, this is no ordinary Saraswati. This Saraswati, in an independent and democratic India, is helpless in the clutches of the newly allegedly elected democratic rulers. She prays to Vidhi, or fate, or destiny, to release her from their clutches. Vidhi, or destiny, like I said, is another synonym for Brahma, who is her husband, as we all know. Her anguish moves us deeply when she says, ತೊದಲು ತುಟಿಗಳನ್ನ ಸಾರಿ ತೊದಲು ತುಟಿಗೆನ್ನ ಬಲಿಕೊಡಬೇಡ ಪತಿಯೇ, meaning, please do not sacrifice me for stuttering or stammering lips. I think it's self explanatory. And another nuance that emerges from this work is the fact that while our country is called Bharata, its language is known as Bharati. Bharati is another synonym for Saraswati, and Bharati is also the synonym for Bharata Mata, as we all know. And the deeper we dig into this, you know, extraordinary Lavani or ballad or satire, the more such insights and gems and intricacies and suggestions come to us. And in the final reckoning, Mahachunavane is not only a highly underrated work of DVG, but it can be, from one perspective, it can be regarded as a near contemporary literary classic in that genre. It is quite unfortunate to uh, have fallen into obscurity, and it deserves wider circulation. It does deserves much, a relook and a deeper study. The work is a profound cultural commentary and an exposition of a range of topics, including dharma, by illustrating the consequences of the violation of dharma and thereby its decline. And in fact, Mahachunavane deserves a full-length monograph by on its own right, and a detailed analysis using a multidisciplinary approach. Uh, could be literary, aesthetics, culture, history, politics, values, ethics, philosophy, and so on. And I have barely touched upon its contours. And with that, I think we can conclude today's session. And I would like to once again express my heartfelt thanks to Kuvempu Bhasha Bharati, Shri Ajakala Girish Bhatt and his entire team of organizing team, and to BN Shashikiran, and to all of you in the audience. Namaste.
Namaskara. Thank you, Sandeep, for that well worded and absorbing, riveting talk. Sandeep began by contextualizing DVG's eminence and popularity even during his lifetime. He recounted a beautiful anecdote that people would write letters to DVG with just the three initials, DVG Bangalore, and the letters would find their way to his house. That was the kind of popularity and renown that he enjoyed. And to bring that popularity to our own time, TVG remains equally popular even today, even though many of his contemporaries have withered into oblivion. One of the few metrics to gauge that is how people celebrate him as before his idols on various streets of Bangalore, and buying his books, organizing programs, and celebrating his literature and his own life, basically, as a collective gift to humanity. And Sandeep also spoke about the various genres and subjects that DVG has enriched through his literature, both non-fiction and creative literature. And he gave a very touching and very, I think, very important contribution to DVG studies by outlining the characteristic features of the poetic works of DVG. In one word, Sandeep summarized it as dense classicism, and I think this is a signal and capital observation. And Sandeep also spoke about the plays that DVG has written and the assessment provided by Dr. Hama Nayaka regarding the stageability of DVG's plays. And finally, he focused on a collection of plays called Prahasanatrayi. It is a collection of satire or farces, and this is important in two three aspects. In one, it is that it talks about one of the lesser known facets of DVG's literary contribution, and in a Vyatireka Marga, as we would call it in Indian literature, it talks about how public life had become debased and disfigured, as Sandeep himself mentioned, during DVG's lifetime. And why I say it is Vyatireka Marga, it is because the concepts or the convictions that DVG had espoused and expounded in treatises such as Rajya Shastra, Rajyanga Tattvagulu, etc., they had come to be belied in the actual political happenings in our country, and DVG was pained because of that, and he gave expression to his pain in these farces. And I think that was the reason that Sandeep chose to elaborate on Mahachunavane and Jack Cade, and this is a good way to get introduced to DVG's works. Of course, given the brief compass of the time that is available to talk about DVG's works, it is impossible to go into any degree of depth or detail of DVG's works. But I would like to briefly uh, at least recount the titles of some of the works that DVG wrote, because some of them are remarkable and original contributions that non Kannada people need to be aware of. In the realm of literature and literary criticism, DVG has written treatises such as Sahitya Shakti, monographs such as Kavya Swarasya, which is a remarkable contribution to Indian literary criticism. How the concepts such as Rasa, Dhwani, etc., which have been bequeathed to us by our ancestors, by aestheticians and poeticians, DVG uses those concepts and evolves a new code of literary aesthetics that is remarkable, and he brings together aspects from public life and coalesces them with literary aesthetics, and this approach I think is unique and is a signal contribution of DVG. And in the realm of culture and philosophy, DVG has written what is known today as the genre of self-help books such as Baligundu Nambike, Sanskriti, etc. And these are remarkable monographs that any person, any layman, even the proverbial laity or common person can pick up and use to enrich or enable his own life. So I think that is very important. And DVG focuses on the individual, but does not stop there. He puts the individual against the backdrop of the society at large, and therefore both the uniqueness of the individual, his personal proclivities and capacities are brought forth against the backdrop of what the collective goodwill, of what the collective good entails. And his exposition on our treatises such as the Bhagavad Gita, such as the Ishopanishad, on concepts such as I would say Dharma, Rita, Satya, etc., is phenomenal. His exposition is phenomenal. One can take a look at his exposition of Bhagavad Gita itself. In one word, he focuses on Jivana and as against moksha that our all our acharyas, Sampradayika acharyas had focused on. That is why he has called it Jivana Dharma Yoga. How is the Bhagavad Gita useful to us in order to enrich our own lives? So the perspective that DVG provides us to look at a treatise, a time-honored treatise such as the Bhagavad Gita, is I think very unique, and non-Kannadiga readers would do well to peruse these writings. And one another important contribution of DVG is in the realm of a genre that is unique to himself. It is called creative non-fiction and reflected in his collection of reminiscences, pen portraits, etc., called Jnapaka Chitrashale. It is a photo art gallery of memories, as V. Sitaramaya has translated. It is remarkable. It is cultural history, it is literary history, and it is it is a celebration of life in all its aspects. It gives us a flavor of the kind of political configurations that were prevalent during the realm of the Divans in the princely states such as Mysore, and it goes on to all kinds of cultural nuances that are not at all available in the mainstream literature on the subject. So I think TVG, by this work alone, would stand immortal and would rub shoulders with the greatest of writers in world literature, and non-Kannada readers again would benefit from reading these works in translation. And to just give a sample of any work of DVG is unique in one respect or another. Sandeep himself mentioned a work called Sri Channakeshava Antapura Gite. What it does is it takes up a temple of the Hoysala period, the Belur, the temple at Belur of Chennakeshava, that is dedicated to the deity Chennakeshava. And what he does is he looks at the sculptures at the outer arena of the temple and goes into a mood of contemplation, of questioning and analysis of why these sculptures are here, what is their significance, etc., and comes up with something remarkable which is not at all explored in any other literature. It brings together music, dance, and literature, and the binding factor is philosophy. So, DVG again is unique in this regard. There are many more works of DVG which require mention, but unfortunately, we cannot get into in the course of this lecture. So, with these few words, I would like to thank the president, the registrar, and all the authorities of Kuvempu Bhasha Bharati for bringing together this series of talks in such a remarkable manner, and for today's speaker, Sri Sandeep Balakrishna, for talking about DVG's contributions and for bringing in that perspective of looking at Prahasana Trayi in a Vyatireka Marga as DVG envisioned it himself. So thank you, Sandeep, for that. And I would like to invite all our listeners and audiences to participate in the webinar series, which is to continue in the next week as well. Thank you. Namaste.
Namaste.